Welcome back to RTDNA National Conference. I'm Rashmi Nair, news anchor at CP24. Issues of diversity and inclusion have taken center stage both at this conference and in all of our newsrooms. But it starts earlier than that, doesn't it? Many universities and colleges are facing a reckoning as well. This week, Ryerson School of Journalism announced it will change the name of its masthead publication, The Ryersonian, because of founder Egerton Ryerson's involvement in the establishment of residential schools across this country. Our next panel looks at how our journalism schools are handling issues of race in and out of the classroom. So joining us is Nanaba Duncan, former host and producer of CBC Radio, founder of Media Girlfriends, a podcast production company, most recently the incoming inaugural Carty Chair of Journalism, Diversity and Inclusion Studies at Carleton University. Welcome, Nanaba.
Thank you, Rashmi. I'm glad to be here.
And Karen Pugliese is an award-winning journalist and former executive director of news and current affairs at the Aboriginal Peoples Network. She currently teaches journalism at Ryerson. Welcome, Karen. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have Chantal Chouitou, a recent graduate of BCIT's broadcast and online journalism program. We are looking forward to your insights as well. Chantal, thank you for making time.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be joining you from the Coast Salish territories.
And now we want to talk about the issues of diversity and inclusion and look at it from that educational platform. How and when do we start finding our voices as journalists, and what are the stories that matter to us? Karen, if we can start with the issues at Ryerson right now to give our viewers, everyone participating here, an idea of the latest developments and the concerns that have come out of it. I think a lot of people do identify with that imposter syndrome, not knowing what of their personal lives to bring to their work. What sort of conversations have come out of it, and where are we at now?
I think, well, there's quite a lot that's gone on at Ryerson. I think if you're talking about bringing the personal into journalism, that's a discussion that I think has been taking place in newsrooms as well as in class. We've been dealing with issues of trying to address that idea of the view from nowhere, of trying to address bringing lived experience into journalism and implicit bias in newsrooms. And it's a discussion that we actually have classes like the critical issues class to discuss some of that.
And what are those conversations like?
Well, you know, it's interesting because I think there's quite a lot of writing that's been happening since Black Lives Matter. It's sort of, I mean, it's been around for a while, but it sort of was George Floyd flared up again a year ago. And that moved from the streets into newsrooms and brought in a lot of the same discussions of really that news has a point of view that it says is objective. But by objective, it sometimes is mistaken for a Caucasian male boomer kind of sort of view that thinks, this is who I am, my audience is like me, and anything that doesn't impact a person like me would not be news. And so when you come from a different community and you come into a newsroom and you say, here's a story that's very important to my community, the person who's making the decisions, that gatekeeper, may not necessarily understand that as news, understand the importance of it or the impact of it. So newsrooms are trying to address this, and we look at a lot of examples of that in class. We look at examples of journalists who have written about pushing back on newsrooms, who have walked away from newsrooms to start their own media so that they can have a voice. And we're also very interested in that line between activism and journalism. Can you be a participant in a movement and write, and also be a journalist? I think one of the answers that we've kind of come up with just based on the reality of, you know, where the news industry is today is that in legacy media, you cannot, or at least cannot yet, unless you're doing a column. But in terms of a journalist, you can't. And there are some good reasons for that. Being trusted by different voices that you're trying to cover in the story would be one of them. But there is a lot of room now in alternative media, in starting your own media, to actually be both an advocate and a journalist. So there's a little room for everybody. It's actually kind of an exciting time.
Chantal, you're a recent graduate from BCIT. Congratulations. Welcome to the industry. What was your impression going into the program, and how do you feel now after graduating?
I would certainly say that starting off in the program, I didn't feel comfortable like bringing in stories that were from like my own lived experience, was the stories that was represented around the communities I was a part of, because it felt as though I was bringing in a level of bias into, like, bringing those stories forward. And I'd always find myself trying to push forward a story that I wasn't necessarily passionate about or knew so much about, and like going so much into detail and focusing into that, because it was like, it felt more of an expectation to appeal to the status scope what was initially presented to us, or what was the standard of journalism that I was exposed to at that time. But at the turn of like 2020 and going on getting into my second year, there was this empowerment that I felt to draw from those experiences, and like seeking out those stories that I knew around me, and I felt more comfortable to bring them forward into class, and like to pitch them forward for stories, and take away the guilt I may have been feeling beforehand for not having covered them previously, but doing the best that I can in that moment to adequately and provide the context needed for a story when it was coming to, like, even for just for assignments, or even just producing a story for pitches during our meetings in school.
And you did this all virtually as well. We should acknowledge that your education has been virtual because of this pandemic. Nanaba, you are working virtually as well, but when you do imagine the classroom, what kind of atmosphere is necessary to make sure that we are bringing all of those voices in?
I think the atmosphere comes from the instructor first. And because they are the ones that are setting the atmosphere. They're the ones that set the syllabus. They are the ones that write the very first words about how this is going to go. So one of the things that we've been talking about, I know I'm incoming to Carleton, but I've been having quite a few meetings with joy, mind you. And one of the things that we've been talking about, or that has come to me, is the idea of acknowledging fear that's involved. Fear comes up in journalism in so many ways. It comes up in having to pick up the phone to call someone to ask these questions and wondering if your questions are worded right. But it also shows up when you are approaching a community that you're not familiar with. So now, if you're an instructor and you have not maybe acknowledged some of those fears, or acknowledged that there's even something going on, how could you possibly really approach setting the right atmosphere for the students? So to me, what I am seeing happening is an acknowledgement of what they've missed and where they might go. And so what I think I'll be doing is really trying to acknowledge my own fears as a new professor too, but also encouraging other faculty to just take a step back, take a look at what you've been afraid of, talk about it with yourself, with the faculty, maybe sometimes with the students, and then see what you can do to change. I think that would be where I would start changing the atmosphere. It starts with the instructor.
It does. Based on your educational experience, Nanaba, would you give your journalism experience in the classroom a passing grade or a fail?
With regards to race, I would say it would be a fail, but that was so I did my journalism degree. I got my master's at Western, and I don't remember us having open conversations about race. Anytime that it had, if we were talking about another community, it would be the story on the community, probably something about something bad happening within that community, the troubles they're facing. I mean, I was never encouraged or anything, and I think that that would be why it took me a long time to acknowledge, oh my God, I have never thought of my mother when I think of the listener while I'm doing my work as a radio host or a producer. I have never thought of my mother. And when I really thought about that, when I really acknowledged that to myself, I got really angry. I got really angry because I started to feel like, why? Why is that happening? And so I think that's one of the things that I want to change. I want us to start thinking about, instead of the common thing that you hear at CBC is Susie's in Saskatchewan. What if Susie wasn't white, first of all? And then also, what if we're thinking about Raheem in Markham or Raheem in Brampton? I'm in Toronto, so for anyone who's, those are cities or areas in Toronto neighborhoods. Those are the things that I'm thinking about.
It's the audience who we're imagining. Karen, how do we teach that?
That's a really interesting question. I really like what Kanava said. I just say from my own experience, when I was working in mainstream, I always originally imagined a white audience too. Of course, I spent a lot of time working in Indigenous media. And then you imagine, like I would just say, I'm writing for the Kokum in the community. Nowadays, I just finished writing a piece on the remains of the 215 children who were found outside the Kamloops Indian Residential School in BC. And as I'm writing that, I'm very conscious of staying in my lane as a journalist, not speaking over my people, making space for them in the story, writing it for a non-Indigenous audience so that it's accessible to them, but then reading it a second time so that I'm seeing if it's going to be okay with my community to say the things that I've said. So when you're saying that, like, how do you teach that? I was going to say that I'm a new professor, and I don't know if I've necessarily done that very well yet. But funnily enough, one of my students just called me 2 hours ago and asked me that very question. What is going through your head when you write a piece like that, and how are you doing that? And I said, I read it twice. I read it once for the non-Native audience. I read it again for my accountability back to my community. And so, I mean, as we're kind of going and learning, and I will say I've only taught during the pandemic, it's been a real challenge because you cannot interact with students the way that you want to. And sometimes how you're coming across or what gets left or how short everything has to be because they can only take so much Zoom doesn't really create the space. It hasn't been like the most effective year that I'd hoped it would be. But we have had discussions with students and discussion groups where those conversations are happening, and they are built into the program. And I'm thinking mostly of the Journalism 400 Critical Issues course that I taught that covers like that big basket of things. But I also taught investigative reporting. And a lot of my examples were Indigenous journalism or BIPOC journalism in there in terms of the investigations. And so it brings up these conversations about how do police treat people of color and how do police treat Indigenous people. And they kind of get baked into the conversations of investigating journalism. I also taught reporting in Indigenous communities, which is a very interesting experience because I inherited the course from a non-Native professor who set it up completely differently than I would have, but in an intelligent way, because I would have set it up as if people were going to report on Indigenous issues all the time. She understood that most of them won't. This is going to be a beat. So she set them up by beats like art and sports and politics and business. And within there, created a conversation about how these things are covered and what are the best practices. So I just tweaked it and brought in maybe a few more examples that were written by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. And then, compared those point of views and how ideas are communicated, which was an interesting look at things.
Yeah, it's always about just refreshing our own lens, right? Chantal, can we get your thoughts on your educational experience recently and thinking about the audience?
When it comes to thinking about the audience, I think more than ever now, after everything that's happened, it's so important to stress to students the diversity within Canada's landscape. It's always been centered around whiteness, I'd say, and that's been the main narrative that's been pushed forward. But it's really important, like, that students get the understanding from the get-go, rather than when things flare up and then you start talking about things as opposed to them being in isolation. But from the get-go, you get that understanding from your learning experience that there is a very plethora of people within the audience that are listening to the stories, and there is a need for providing that context, and not just reporting stories or teaching skills to report within the industry in isolation, but connecting the context with those skills and empowering students that they're able to not only feel the comfort to go into communities that aren't necessarily their own, but to accurately and fairly report stories that are outside of their comfortable environment. Because again, I think the most the greatest blend, I'd say, that we may, students may feel as you're starting out would be this understanding that you get the skills pushed first before you're given the capacity or the tools you necessarily need to go into a community and understand the various contextual issues that surround that community before you enter in and start reporting in it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of the tools is always respect, right? Respect and understanding. Chantel, what would you give our educational experience so far? It's fresh, but would you give it a passing grade or a fail?
I think it's neither a pass nor a fail. I think it's evolving in the sense that we've had the learning curve of the pre-George Floyd era, where reporting was, whatever the status quo was. But now we're encouraging more nuances to come into reporting and to come into like the education system. And I find that at the turn of the curve of my learning experience, where there was a lot of guest instructors or guest speakers coming into lectures and speaking about whatever aspect of reporting that they do. It was much more fulfilling to just sit in on those lessons and sit in through those lectures. And I felt invigorated to ask questions when you had somebody else who wasn't necessarily an instructor who you saw on a daily basis, but they're coming in with their lived experience in as a reporter, but not only just as a reporter who's reporting on a certain community or a certain beat, but also just providing the nuances and experiences that they have that aren't necessarily tied or similar to that's always churned within like the curriculum you're given. So it's important that whenever there's an opportunity for other voices to come into the mix of the curriculum, it not only stays linear and strict to just instructors that are regular in school, but also bring in those voices that are from people who are actively doing things in the community as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that lived experience is so powerful, and we're all having that reckoning right now as well. I remember 15 years ago when I got into the industry, I felt a journalist. I just felt like I was a blank slate at the start of the day. I absorbed all the information and then I delivered it. But there's a shift in that now. And Neb, I want to ask you as well. Karen brought up that point about how police report on things, and when we think about George Floyd, the initial news release that went out from that police department the day George Floyd died, it circulated again after Derek Chauvin was convicted of his murder. And when you read it, you realize that his death is not the most prominent detail in that news release. So do we need to revisit in our classrooms how we handle information from authoritative figures?
Yes. That's the answer. Of course we do.
Yeah. How do we do that?
Well, we have examples like that, and this is something that is going to be part of my job to start with as well, is to complicate how we accept, how we perceive what we get from institutions. So how do we complicate that? What other questions can we ask now that we know that we don't always get the real story, the right story, the truth? How do we work around that? Do we ignore them? Do we push a little bit to find out more? What can we do now? And I think that having those conversations, actually asking those things and having the discussion in the class, for me, even if we begin to have those conversations, we'll be in the right place. Because that's all we're looking for. We are just looking for people to start questioning what has always been understood to be the status. That's all we want to do. And when you start to have that muscle of questioning, it doesn't mean that you always disbelieve. It just means that you don't take something at face value right from the beginning. And that's all we want. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's journalism.
Things. Yeah, I like that.
Isn't that good journalism?
And to complicate things, I mean, I think people who don't like the media would say that that's what we do, but to me, it sounds like we need time and we need focus to be able to do that, right? And Karen, you mentioned those beats. Should we go back to that? I mean, we have journalists who cover little details of so many stories. Should we go back to that beat reporting where you as a journalist are an expert in something?
I don't know if that's quite the way that we need to go. I mean, being a beat journalist and having an expertise in something is on one hand great. On the other hand, it can be siloing. I think that Chantel kind of hit on something when she was talking earlier, and she was talking about recognizing other points of view. And I think there's something that we have to do, that we go in and we recognize the limits of our own implicit bias and believability to the point that you're talking about police. I would say that there's similarities between the press release that initially was released when George Floyd was murdered and the killing of Colton Bushy. And also we saw the report on how his family was treated by police, right? So believing those experiences and questioning authority is something that needs to be baked in. And also understanding the realities of other communities and the limits of our own knowledge and our own education, and trying to figure out what we don't know, so that when you hear something that doesn't make sense, that you sit there and you go, okay, why are they saying that? And where is that coming from? And realizing that it might be a whole world of information that you don't know. To make it like a little plainer of, like how we would do that in journalism schools. We do have these courses. We have courses like reporting in Indigenous communities, reporting in queer communities, reporting in Black communities. But one of the things that they're letting me try at the university is I said you shouldn't have to take a separate course, in order to get at these things. And they should be part of the core courses. So I'm working just with one of the professors who teaches the first year core course to try to put in a base knowledge of treaties, Indigenous rights, like Métis inherent rights, First Nations inherent rights, where the legal source of those come from, and why they're important is in so many issues that we cover involving conflict over land, water, and resources. That's the basis of them, and it's not understood well in newsrooms. So if you can make everybody a little bit more powerful in learning how to learn about another community and getting that basis, then I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, and it just makes me think of fast journalism again, because there's the classroom atmosphere and then there's 24-hour news, right? And the news cycle that we have these days has just been nonstop. Chantal, I understand you've had some internships since you graduated. Have you noticed a difference from the classroom to the newsroom?
A difference. I think for me, the thing that I found most interesting, really is hard to grapple with, was the pace at which that daily news happens and when you're in an actual newsroom as opposed to when you're in the classroom setting, and the impact that the daily news stands to have as opposed to having a long form or like a feature story that goes into depth. It's like that balance that I'm trying to understand as to where exactly, when you're telling a story, how exactly will you be able to achieve that impact and like telling a story effectively in a way that puts across the heart and the people of the story at the center, but not necessarily just brushing over the details because you're trying to reach that deadline or trying to acclimate to the environment of the fast news cycle. So there's definitely a difference, but I think for me it wasn't too drastic because of my learning experience, where I pretty much did everything, and I was capacitated in that sense, where I was able to adjust to that newsroom environment. But it's definitely felt like I was taking everything I learned in the last 2 years and packing it all in the space of one day and trying to effectively put it and put it into use every single day, of which at the beginning it was hard, but once I got the hang of it, I was like, oh, okay, I could understand where the nuance of this could be tied into when I'm interviewing someone or pre-interviewing them, when like I'm going into a feature story in depth.
Yeah. What is your instinct telling you? Do you prefer long form or the daily grind?
Personally, I think I prefer long form because I get to interact with the people and get to the heart of the story, as opposed to the daily news. Daily news is great for keeping people informed, but sometimes the fact that it glosses over some of those important nuances is what gets to me, where I definitely feel the tug to go towards more long form stories.
So there's a gap there, right, Nanaba, in the classroom experience and then in the workforce. Do you consider that when you think about curriculum and how to prepare students?
What this makes me think of is how important it is that we make the changes in journalism school. Like Karen was talking about, baking it into the classes, or baking these considerations into the classes, because if we know that if we acknowledge unconscious bias, then maybe what we can do is slowly change that bias to always be asking that question that I think Connie Walker talks about this question a lot, which is, where did this story begin? And so if we naturally do that, and we learn that as a skill, that muscle that Karen was talking about, then maybe it would be easier in daily news. You would be able to ask the right questions more quickly when it's fast.
Yeah, it can be jarring when you go from the classroom into the newsroom. And I want to remind everyone who's participating here that we are taking your questions for our panelists, for Nanaba, Karen, and Chantel. We have a question here. Do you think a re-education of race issues and the mistreatment of certain groups should be taught in Canadian journalism schools? Karen, what are your thoughts there?
Yes and no. I think that what we're trying to do, or I think there's space for it, right? Like, I don't think that a journalism class can be a history class or a social studies class. But what you can do is you can look at the way media has covered things, the mistakes that have been made in media, and try to include some of that context in there. I think that it is great when people take other history courses and other political courses and shore up their journalism skills with that wider learning, and you read more broadly. I think that's something that we need to teach people to do, because when you get out of school, you can't stop reading and you can't stop learning. You don't get your journalism diploma and then get to say, well, I know everything now. You've learned how to write and you've learned the basics, but you're going to be put into new situations with new information all the time. And you've got to have a lifelong learning approach to learning, I think.
Mm-hmm. And that is then the lived experience, right? What our passions are, what we're interested in, then fueling our journalism.
Is that for me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, it can be, like, one of the things that I guess I noticed this year, I'm going to tell you, I'm just going to talk about all the mistakes I made because I'm a new prof. So, I mean, I'm full of making mistakes.
I am listening very,
Okay, so in teaching the reporting in Indigenous community course, I gave all the students the assignment. You kind of inherit a course and sometimes you don't change too much of it, the first year. So they had an assignment to go out and do stories. And, for somebody like me who's worked in these communities for a long time, I built up relationships, so I don't think of it anymore. I pick up a phone and I know who to call, and they take my call and they talk to me. But there is a lot going on in Indigenous communities right now. They have a lot of suspicion of media, always have, for a good reason. And we're in the middle of a pandemic. People are busy, and so they weren't taking the students' calls. And I realized that this was not going to be as easy for them. And maybe instead of doing the story, what I should have done is taught them how to build the relationship and then do a story. So I think it's lived experience, but I think you can also learn from somebody else's lived experience, because in a way we all have lived experience, right? There's a generation of women who are not of color, who are white or Caucasian, who went into newsrooms and faced enormous sexism. And so they know what it's like to not be taken seriously, to not have your intelligence or talent taken seriously, and to have to push back. And so while they may not understand all the issues around race, when we go and have conversations with them, there's something familiar there that they can understand. So I think we can all draw on shared experiences in order to learn about those experiences we don't have.
Yeah, breaking those glass ceilings and feminism in the newsroom, absolutely. Like it's been a generation's worth of it. It's interesting to hope that people who went through that can understand the next generation's plight as well when it comes to Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBTQ issues. There are so many other diverse groups that are fighting for a voice in a newsroom right now. When you think about curriculum, Nanaba, how do you incorporate everybody into a conversation about journalism? If we want to pick one story, like the pandemic.
How do you include everyone?
Yeah, how would you tackle, covering the pandemic in a diverse way in order to make sure that everyone's voices are represented?
Well, I would say something like that has to be done intentionally. You can't. You wouldn't be able to leave that to chance. And if you are trying to do something with respect to different diversities, then I think I would leave it there. It's just that you've got to be very direct about it, knowing that we have our defaults. In order to change those defaults, we must be intentional. So if you want to change it, if you want to think about the pandemic with, thinking of Filipino nurses, then go to the communities, go to the Filipino nurse community, and do it from there. That's what I would say. Is that it's just got to be intentional. And I don't mean to say that flippantly, like it's so easy, because it's not. But if you want to make change, it's just you've got to be thinking about it all the time and intentional. And it's very, very difficult, of course, for some people. I'll give an example. So when I think about diversity, and when we talk about diversity, often these days we're thinking about racial diversity specifically. We're not always speaking about disability, but we should be, right? And so when we're talking about, when it comes back to the pandemic, that's something that you would have to think about intentionally. What about people who have chronic disabilities? That's something you have to think about intentionally. So.
Yeah, and you're reminding me, when it comes to the vaccine rollout, we are still trying to get to that story about people who can't leave their homes, right? We're always talking about people going out to the clinics, and we have some doctors saying, what about the people who can't leave their homes? Why aren't we getting vaccines to those households? But is that the most dominant story? No, but hopefully that voice can be brought in and have that coverage there. But Chantal, was there anything in your experience in the classroom where you thought a story wasn't going to be able to be pitched, or did you have an impression that some things were off limits?
There was never that impression that something was off limits at all. It's just a matter of getting more instructors or professors who encourage you towards a certain direction. You said that give that encouragement. That was, I'd say, was lacking. It was there, but it wasn't as prominent as you would want it to be in an environment where there's definitely a multiculturalism that exists, and there's definitely different perspectives and people who have shared experiences that could be appealed to. So I'd say that it may have been there, but it wasn't as prominent. It's something I'd encourage maybe like people in journalism schools to work on, encouraging students habitually and continually to push forward, that encouragement to seek out stories from minority communities or from like ethnically or other diverse communities. That way you don't leave students wondering whether it's okay or should I just relegate a story like a story around like Black people just necessarily for Black History Month, which I find like in my first year was kind of the vibe that that was there, that it only like issues around Black communities were centered, or well, at least they put forward or push forward prominently like during Black History Month, but all throughout the year, there's one of those, you can work on any other story that you feel like doing, but there's not that encouragement to continually and habitually seek out stories from minority communities. But I'd say that from this moment on, like there has to be that momentum to continuously encourage students all throughout the year, whether it's not just Black History Month or Asian Heritage Month, like let it just be a consistent thing for students to always want to seek out stories that don't necessarily fit the status quo that's been there, but that also invite more color and invite more nuances to the narratives of the kind of stories and relationships they build with as they're going through the education.
While you were in school, you sought out a mentor on your own?
Oh, yes, I did. It's something I think that I felt was very important for me to find a mentor outside of my classroom setting. That way I not only get the industry insight, or at least some preparation of what it would be like in the industry, but for me as I'm going through school to understand what I need to be doing to capacitate myself ready to go into the industry, and understanding where I might have been lacking in terms of my education. So I know it's not only just for the benefit of the stories I was producing in schools, but having a mentor also just helped me, navigate some of the personal experiences that I had going through school that overlapped or may have affected the way that I was producing my stories, or the narrative I was trying to push forward in my stories. So I'll give an example and say there's this one instance where I was an acting producer for the week, and we were working on producing a TV show by the end of the week. And one of the things we had to do, this is always in the producer's manual, was to always remind people to post stories on social media. And I was like, okay, that's well, we're living in a digital age, and so connecting with the audience is very important. It's a necessary skill, and that's something I had to do like twice a day in the meetings we had. And one of my instructors, as I was saying that and doing those reminders, he closed the meeting off by saying, I hope you all remember to do what Chantal is saying. You know how aggressive she gets about these things. I was like, when I heard the word aggressive in that instance, it really just took me back a little bit. And I went and spoke to my mentor about it. And I was like, hey, so we're going through meetings and everything was good. And then my instructor just brushes off this comment at the end of the day, like it was nothing, so casually. And it may not have come off, in a harmful way, definitely. But for me, after hearing that, it made me want to feel very reclusive and not want to push forward or like do anything actively to push people to do their stories anymore, because I felt as though I was translating, or at least coming across as aggressive in the way that it was telling people to, you need to constantly be on top of your social media game because there's a social media report at the end of the day that affects your marks. So if you don't want to get bad grades, just do, your social media stuff. And I spoke to my mentor about it, and she was like, oh, low-key, that was a microaggression, in case you don't pick up on it. And I see why and understand why you felt that way, because it's something that definitely happens to a person who looks like you, but it may not have come across as harmful, but to you, it definitely felt harmful because there's nuance around your experiences that surround things like that. And so having a mentor in that instance just sort of helped me process why it is I shouldn't let something like that affect me and not carry out my duties as a producer that week, or at least not be so passive about my duties as a producer that week, was something I'd say kind of helped me to have the backbone for what the industry might look like, or what the industry has been like for a person who's been in my shoes. And without a mentor, it would have been something that just glossed over me. And I was like, okay, maybe I shouldn't be doing what I was doing before. Or really, it was just the right thing. It's just because I was saying it may have just come off as aggressive. So in that instance, I felt it was very, very important to have a mentor who could use as a sounding board, because this definitely affected me in a personal way, but I couldn't let it affect the work that I was doing in school.
Yes, language in the classroom. We have two new educators on this panel. I'd love to get both of your thoughts. Karen, especially with you being at Ryerson, and I should mention in our Q&As, we have a link to an article on the background of things that have unfolded at Ryerson University here, if anybody wants to read up on it. But how important then is the language in our classroom, and how much of it needs to change?
I think we're working on that. We're working on, there's been some developments in the industry that have been very useful. Like, for example, in gender identification, where when you sit down to interview somebody, you make sure you ask, what are the proper gender terms to identify you? And we ask that in classes, and sometimes students, like Nanaba has done, although she's not a student, but she, her. So I know her proper pronouns. I think also there's, in teaching the Indigenous reporting class, in the communities, Indigenous people will, and I will fall back on them. I will use terms like Native or Indian. I will call myself a half-breed. And so teaching people, like, those are terms that you might hear in the community, but it's one of those things that I can say it, but you can't say it, and sort of the politics around how you name things. Those are things that people need to learn, and people are actually really eager to learn. They want to know the correct way to address things, and they don't want to make mistakes.
Yeah, Nanaba, will the language change in your classroom compared to the last time you were in a classroom?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's been a while, Reshmi. I know I look young. But yeah, I think that things will definitely have changed when it comes to pronouns, when it comes to capitalization of certain words. All of that has changed. And I think that the students will tell us what else needs to change. Yeah. And we'll have to have those conversations.
Yeah, listening is important. Do you have any examples of something that would be archaic that you learned in a classroom when you were in J school? I'm trying to think of, the audience part that you've all discussed is really staying with me as well, because we're constantly.
Oh, I think I know one. Sorry to interrupt you. The word female, right? Because now we're saying woman. If we're talking about someone's gender, we are not saying the word female.
I didn't realize that.
Well, this is something that I have learned myself recently. And it is that the word female applies to a biological term. And I would be very open for someone to tell me that my understanding is wrong right now. But that is something that I have learned recently.
We're not saying female or male. We're saying man, woman.
Man, woman.
Yeah. I'm going to have to tell my friends at CP24. Do universities do
we are
enough?
all learning, and we really are all learning, and I think that's what this is about.
Yes.
A lot of us had to learn when it comes to changing pronouns. We felt really embarrassed when we misgendered someone, and then we moved on. And now for some of us, we don't have any problem. It is a lot easier for some of us to use they them. Whereas before, a lot of people, we questioned it, we pushed back, we didn't get it, we ridiculed it, or whatever it is that we did that was bad. But many of us are at a different place now. We understand it better. It's about that journey. And if you are willing to understand where the change comes from, then the change can happen easier.
Yes, to appreciate the fluidity of it, right? And the newness of it. I want to go back to mentorships. Do universities do enough to encourage mentors? Ninaba, what do you think?
Because I'm at the beginning, I don't know that I can answer that question. I would probably give it to Karen, but I have noticed when it comes to the associations that different journalism associations seem to be really trying to push mentorship. I know that CAJ has started one, and I think some others, but I think Karen would be better to answer.
Well, did you have a mentor at Western?
No, I wasn't smart like Chantel to get one for myself. The mentorship that I've gotten is really has happened, I would say, within the last 10 years.
Yeah. Well, and Media Girlfriends offers mentorship.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I think we push that is because we have seen how well mentorship can change a person's career, can change their experience within that career. Those conversations, Chantel, the one that you described, where you just need someone to talk to be like, am I like, is this just me?
Am I overreacting?
And then sometimes they'll say, yeah, it is just you. Often it's like, here's what's going on here. And then you're like, oh, okay, cool. I know how to address this now.
Karen, what are your thoughts then? Ninaba didn't have a mentor when she was back at Western. Chantel took it upon herself to find one. Should it be a responsibility of universities to connect students with mentors?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And Chantel, they gave such a good example of just like the very simple things that you can do, like just having somebody to bounce something off on. I was involved in mentorships for Carleton University because I'm an alumni there. And I've mentored 2 students through there. And I find that often that they come in and they're like, well, I don't really know what to do with this. Maybe you can help me with my stand-ups, maybe. And it does turn into often, because I've had 4th year students, a little bit more about how do I find a job and how do I navigate from university into the industry, which is complicated right now. And so I think they were useful. I hope they were useful for students in that respect. I've done a couple through the Canadian Association of Journalists, and those ones are for more mid-career journalists. And one came in every week with a series of really defined questions of things that she wanted to know. How do you handle this? How do you, if somebody rejects your story, how do you pitch it again? How did you handle it when you couldn't get along with somebody at work? Like really interesting things that kind of make you think about, you go, I don't know if I know that. And well, you know what? I did get that to work once and this is what I tried. And so a lot of them can be more than just about, putting the pen to paper or typing the words. Ryerson just launched one. And they were setting students up with alumni. And they did notice that a lot of students wanted somebody who was of a similar gender, race, or faith to what they had. And I think that's because it's such a big conversation in the industry right now.
I want to keep taking some more questions from everyone participating in this panel. Thank you for sending your questions in. We have about 10 more minutes for them. So here is a question coming in from Nicole. Besides teaching students how to seek out stories that reflect their communities, is there any discussion about researching and using cultural storytelling techniques that such communities are familiar with? Do you think there's an appetite for this in mainstream media? Karen, you touched on that, but can you expand on that, using cultural storytelling techniques in mainstream media?
Yeah, so to answer Nicole's question, it isn't on the curriculum now, but it might be next year, because now you've really made me think about it. In APTN, we did turn things a little bit on their head, and we did talk, especially in the beginning, about how we should tell stories. Our communities are natural storytellers, naturally tell stories orally. What could we do with them? And we decided, like, instead of regular beats, a lot of this had to do with Dan David and some of his philosophies about reconciliation and community news. But instead of doing beats like sports or politics, what would the beats be in an Indigenous community? Might they be youth, elders, community, women? Things that are more from our perspective. I think there's some things that we tried that didn't work so well. Like in television, we tried to keep ourselves out of the story and just sort of have no narration and have it very cinema verite. And it turned out our people didn't like that very much. They wanted the accountability of seeing who was telling the story, and they wanted something that looked a little bit more of what they were used to. So they're interesting things. I don't really know that legacy media is doing that kind of experimentation, but I do note that Connie Walker's Finding Cleo's story did have a lot of self-referential storytelling in it that felt traditional to me, and I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, and I love that we are talking about Connie Walker so much.
Everybody loves Connie Walker. She's brilliant.
I had the extraordinary opportunity to work with her briefly. She's incredible. Chantel, do you have thoughts on this? You came from Zimbabwe. You studied Canadian journalism in a Canadian classroom. Did you notice anything about the storytelling that you were trained to apply? Is there something different out there that we could be using as storytelling?
I definitely think that the way that the storytelling happens, like over here on the Western side, is quite interesting, because there's definitely that encouragement to bring in that base, being in the people and focusing on the people that are off the story, rather than just looking at the numbers that make up the people, if that makes sense. And it's quite interesting in that sense. But as Karen was talking about, like the oral stories that are passed down within communities, I think that's not so prominent, I find, within the mainstream media. And I think it would work in terms of like finding, or at least showing the nuances that bring people together, that tell the shared experiences that different people have, that the traditional mainstream way of storytelling may not necessarily get at the heart at doing.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know you're passionate about storytelling. Media Girlfriends launched as a podcast to tell stories of women in journalism. Where do you think our storytelling should go? How can it shift or change?
You know what? I absolutely love this question of applying different like cultural ways of storytelling to journalism. That is something that we would have to do intentionally. We would have to tell the industry that this is happening, and we would all have to agree that these changes are happening. Because like what you were saying, Karen, you can try something different, but if the appetite isn't there, or sometimes it just doesn't work. So something that I've been thinking about goes back to the way that my father used to tell us stories. So we would sit down and he would say, once upon a time, and we would have to respond, time. So it's once upon a time. And I have been thinking about a certain podcast idea, and I was thinking, what if I could apply a West African sensibility to telling the story? This could only work, I think, for children. But what if before the story, somebody had to say once upon a time, and the children there listening outside in their homes had to respond time. That's one way that I could apply what I have learned. But the point that I'm really making is that for podcasts, that would be fun and cool because we can do that with podcasting. But when it comes to news journalism, it would have to be a very, very big it would have to be a pretty big agreement. The other thing that I'm thinking about is that when it comes to storytelling on the air in radio, we want the story to keep going. But there are so many people, wonderful people, who tell their stories slowly.
Mm.
They take time. And sometimes it takes them 5 minutes to get to the gold. What if we all decided that we would wait for the gold? That would require a big change, wouldn't it? Like, we don't
Find
have
the
to say,
5 minutes,
okay,
right?
right?
Yeah.
Everybody would have to say, all right, take 10 minutes instead of 5. No. Like, so I love the idea. I would love to try it. And I think it would probably work best with certain, like, a different culturally focused media first.
Yeah. Karen mentioned those alternative medias
Yeah.
out there and different platforms. And I think mainstream media needs to get on the same page. Another question that I hope we do have time for is about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The TRC's calls to action challenged J schools to place far more emphasis on Indigenous context, issues, and history. That was 5 years ago. How much has changed then, Karen?
Okay, so being new to the university, it's hard for me to say what has changed, but they do have the reporting and Indigenous communities courses. They are working or letting me work to incorporate things. Like, everybody's very open-minded. I think it's hard for them to know what to do. And there's only, in the J school, there's only 2 of us who are Indigenous. The other one being Duncan McHugh, who's obviously there part-time because he's got a full-time gig at CBC. So they're very open-minded to making the changes. The students want them. I mean, like, it seems that way. We were talking just before we came on about students deciding to remove the name of Ryerson from the Ryersonian, Ryerson Review of Journalism, sort of all the school papers that have it in there. And that was done with the support of the faculty in journalism. There were committees about it, and the decision was made by the students, but with consultation. So it's evolving. And I think that it's sort of moving as fast as it can. It's going to be trial and error. And I think it's going to get better and better as the years go on.
What would make it move faster? I hear you on it's moving as fast as it can. I imagine something must be able to make it move faster. Danaba, is there, do you feel that pace that needs to change? Or Chantel, do you want to weigh in on that? As new to the scene, is there some pacing that needs to change in how we take on the change that's necessary in journalism?
I'll say one thing when it comes to change is that the people in power just make the decision. They
Yeah.
just make the decision. I'll give you an example. At CBC, we have unconscious bias training. We had it years and years ago. And then, and I think it was something that some people took and some people didn't. But someone at CBC, I think in the last year, said, this is now mandatory. Everyone must do it. And that was just a decision that was made. So I think that when it comes to change, we are able. It's about the will. It's about the values. And I know that some people will be listening and say, it's not that simple. And I understand that it's not that simple because you are not making the decision by yourself. But I would argue that for some things, if you want to make it work, you just make it work.
It makes sense to me. I'm glad you're in the position that you're in. Chantel, what are your thoughts on pacing, on just trying to improve sooner rather than later?
I think I'll piggyback off what Nana Abba said about the change. If it needs to happen, it will happen, and just say something like along the lines of there's definitely a need for like stepping up and stepping down that needs to happen within the leadership positions in journalism schools, and that's definitely something that I'd say is really hard to say as a student who's coming out of school. But because my experience was great and everything, and there's definitely efforts when those efforts where you had guest instructors coming in or guest speakers coming in to speak, that was a moment of, the whole stepping down. But it felt so temporary that after like a week or two of that lesson, it passes over and you're like, okay, we're moving on to whatever that's within the curriculum. But if there's that permanence within that stepping up or stepping down of voices or like instructors that bring in different perspectives, I think it would accelerate the change within how stories, or at least students, are capacitated just to tell stories.
Is that, I mean, did you have those conversations with the other kids, with other students in your program?
Yes, there's definitely conversations about how some of the instructors, the way that they taught the curriculum may have been outdated in the sense, at least it didn't take into account the nuances of the present times we're living in. But, you were addressing it within the institution itself. It becomes tricky to navigate because you are definitely receiving a worthwhile education. It's just that when there's that missed opportunity for something to be brought on long term, it's just disheartening to see. But it's a matter of time and allowing time to take place for those changes to happen. But there's definitely the need for that intention for the stepping up and stepping down to happen within the J schools themselves.
Yeah.
Something that I would add is that even when you do make a decision, let's say you make we are going to do this now, it's possible that not everybody will see the effects of it or even know that your decision was made until 3-4 years later. So some of the things that even me, I'll be complaining about right now, somebody might actually be addressing that. And so I think that that's where, for someone like me, I want to start to be part of those conversations now because, okay, what change are we making? How can I help you make it happen now is where I'm coming from. What can I do to help that thing that we're trying to change happen now?
And maybe some of it is hesitation in that pacing where it might be a little slow to change. But Chantel, did you feel like you could challenge the institution if you had the consensus of the classroom? Could you challenge what you were being taught?
I never saw any opportunity to challenge what the institution and what we were being taught. Because for me, it was an all-rounded education. That's like the thing that I didn't quite appreciate, or at least value, was the impermanence of those guest lectures that would come in. Because for me, they made the most impact in terms of delivering something that would make me feel like I'm a part of the classroom conversation and not necessarily just a bystander and having curriculum and like skill sets thrown at me, or at least trying to adapt to that situation. I remember this one lecture where we had, I think it was for my advanced journalism class, where we had a guest speaker come in and their agenda was to talk about sports journalism and diversity within sports journalism, but it just veered off into talking about just decolonization and speaking into how as journalists, we ought to, or at least aspiring journalists, I'd say, because you're still in school, what we ought to do in terms of capacitating ourselves and making those connections and understanding that the whole basis of journalism is having conversations with people, and the more nuances and perspectives you have, the better and more accurate your conversations, or at least your storytelling, can be. And it's not that it wasn't stressed with the other instructors that were there on a permanent full-time basis. It's just that when you have a guest lecturer coming in, giving you this seed of knowledge, it makes greater impact. So in terms of designing the curriculum, I'm not too sure how that would go about, but there's definitely that semblance that I thought that guest lecturers, at least for me, because they were coming in with their lived experiences from whatever backgrounds experiences that they've had, it spoke more efficiently and more impactful in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that is our time, and I appreciate all of your insights, fresh from the classroom. Chantel Tritu, thank you for your insights, and fresh into the classrooms, Karen Pugliese and Nanaba Duncan. Thank you all for your insights and for making time for us.
Thank you, Rashmi.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you as well to this year's Gold Conference sponsors, including Ipsos, CNN News Source, Google, CBC News, CTV News, City News, and Global News. Coming up at 4 p.m. Eastern, we're going to continue our theme of reckoning and recovery, taking a closer look at the issues of trauma and mental health in newsrooms. Although not a new field of study, this has been a particularly difficult year as incidents of hate and violence impact staff who are already suffering through the mental health challenges of a global pandemic. So we'll hear some personal stories and ask the experts about coping strategies, how to recognize the signs kinds of stress among colleagues as well. And then coming up at 5 p.m. Eastern, we're going to turn the tables and take a look at how journalists can sometimes further traumatize the victims they report on through our use of language and our methods of reporting. We'll learn from Toronto journalist Tamara Cherry, who now studies in this field, how compassionate reporting can make a big difference to the lives of those we cover. While we reset for the next panel, let's take a quick look at how the language we choose in our stories can sometimes do more harm than good when it comes to reporting on issues of addiction. Here's a compelling message with some helpful tips from the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction.